He told her they were done. Unknown to him, she was pregnant with a triplet that will decide their future. 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days. That's how long it had been since Michael Harrison slammed the door on what he thought was the biggest mistake of his life, never knowing that Amara's silence as he walked away wasn't acceptance, but the stunned quiet of a woman carrying 3 heartbeats that would one day come looking for their father. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Michael's downtown Atlanta penthouse, casting geometric shadows across the marble floors he'd grown accustomed to walking alone. At 34, he had everything he'd convinced himself he wanted: a pharmaceutical company worth millions, a pristine reputation in the business community, and a life free from the complications that had once threatened to derail his carefully constructed world. He stood before his bathroom mirror, adjusting the Windsor knot of his silk tie, the same precise ritual he'd performed every morning for the past 3 years. The reflection staring back was that of a successful man, sharp jawline clean-shaven, blonde hair perfectly styled, blue eyes that had learned to show only what was necessary in boardroom negotiations. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleep and full consciousness, another pair of eyes haunted those morning reflections. Warm brown eyes that had once looked at him with a love so pure it had terrified him into running. What do you think drives someone to walk away from love when it gets too real? Have you ever made a choice you later questioned? The notification on his phone buzzed against the marble countertop, pulling him from thoughts he'd spent 3 years training himself not to have. His assistant's message was brief. Board meeting moved to 10 a.m. Henderson Industries merger documents need final review. Michael smiled, the kind of smile that had graced magazine covers and investor presentations. Work was the one constant that never disappointed, never asked for more than he was willing to give, never looked at him with eyes that seemed to see straight through the walls he'd built around his heart. Meanwhile, across the city in East Atlanta, Amara Collins was living a vastly different morning routine. The 2-bedroom apartment she shared with her 3 children was a symphony of controlled chaos, small voices calling for juice boxes, the sound of tiny feet running across hardwood floors that creaked in places she'd learned to navigate around, and the gentle hum of a life built from love, determination, and the kind of strength that only single mothers truly understand. "Mama, Liam took my yellow crayon," 5-year-old Zoe announced, her curly hair bouncing as she marched into the kitchen with the indignation only a child could muster over such grave injustices. "Liam, baby, we share in this house," Amara called out, her voice carrying the patient authority she'd perfected over years of managing 3 strong-willed children on her own. She stood at the stove, flipping pancakes while simultaneously braiding 6-year-old Maya's hair, a skill born of necessity and mother's intuition. At 29, Amara had grown into the kind of woman who commanded respect not through power or wealth, but through quiet resilience. Her dark skin glowed with the warmth of someone who'd found purpose in the midst of struggle, and her eyes, those same brown eyes that had once loved Michael Harrison with everything in her, now carried the wisdom of a woman who'd learned to love herself and her children fiercely enough to make up for the love that had walked away. The apartment was small but filled with light, the walls decorated with children's artwork and photographs that told the story of a family built on intention rather than accident. There were no pictures of Michael, no trace of the man who'd contributed half of each child's DNA, but none of their daily reality. Amara had made that choice deliberately. Her children would know love, security, and worth that didn't depend on someone else's presence or validation. "Mama, are we going to see Daddy today?" Liam asked, his question cutting through the morning routine like a blade Amara never quite learned to deflect painlessly. The question came regularly, usually from one of the 3, and each time it landed in her chest with the same complicated mixture of sadness and determination. She knelt down to Liam's eye level, taking his small hands in hers. "Baby, remember what we talked about. You have Mama, and you have each other, and that makes our family complete and special and strong." Her voice was gentle but firm, the same tone she'd used hundreds of times to answer the question that had no easy answer. But as she looked into Liam's eyes that carried flecks of blue that reminded her painfully of someone else, she felt the familiar weight of a decision she'd been contemplating for months. The children were asking questions she could no longer answer with deflection. They deserved to know where they came from, even if the man who'd contributed to their existence had made it clear he wanted no part of their future. Later that morning, as Michael sat in his corner office reviewing merger documents, his secretary knocked softly on the door. Patricia had been with the company for 15 years, long enough to remember when he'd been different, more spontaneous, more likely to laugh, more human somehow. "Mr. Harrison, there's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she said it's personal and very important." Michael looked up from the papers spread across his mahogany desk, his brow furrowing. Personal visits were rare in his carefully controlled world. Did she give a name? Patricia hesitated, her expression suggesting she was delivering news that might not be welcome. "She said her name is Amara Collins, and that you'd remember her." The name hit Michael like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and causing the pen in his hand to slip from suddenly nerveless fingers. 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days, and suddenly the past was standing in his building's lobby, threatening to unravel everything he'd built in her absence. "Tell her," he began, then stopped. What could he tell her? That he was in a meeting. That he'd moved on. That hearing her name spoken aloud had just shattered 3 years of carefully constructed peace. "Tell her I'll be down in 5 minutes." As Patricia left, closing the door behind her, Michael stood and walked to the window that overlooked the city. Somewhere out there, Amara was waiting, the woman he'd convinced himself he'd forgotten, the woman whose voice had been the soundtrack to the happiest and most terrifying months of his life. He remembered the last time he'd seen her, the way her face had crumpled when he'd told her he couldn't do it anymore, couldn't handle the intensity of what they had together. She'd been standing in her apartment doorway, and he'd been walking away down the hallway, convinced he was saving them both from something that burned too bright to last. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he'd driven away that night, was that Amara had been carrying news that would have changed everything. News she'd never gotten the chance to share before his fear had built a wall between them that seemed impossible to cross. Now, 3 years later, she was downstairs, and Michael found himself facing the possibility that some walls weren't meant to keep things out. They were meant to keep things in, and sometimes, what we try hardest to contain finds a way to break free anyway. The elevator ride to the lobby felt like the longest journey of his life. The elevator descended with mechanical precision, each floor marking a countdown toward a moment Michael wasn't sure he was prepared for. His reflection in the polished steel doors showed a man who looked composed, the same face that had negotiated million-dollar deals and commanded boardrooms, but his hands betrayed him, trembling slightly as he adjusted his tie for the 3rd time. When the doors opened into the marble lobby of Harrison Pharmaceuticals, Michael's eyes immediately found her. Amara stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, her silhouette backlit by the Atlanta afternoon sun, and for a moment, time collapsed. She was exactly as he remembered and completely transformed. The same graceful posture, the same way she held her chin when she was nervous, but there was something new in her bearing, a quiet strength that hadn't been there 3 years ago. She turned as his footsteps echoed across the marble, and their eyes met for the first time in 3 years, 2 months, and 15 days. The impact was immediate and devastating, all the careful emotional distance he'd constructed crumbling in the space of a heartbeat. "Hello, Michael." Her voice was softer than he remembered, but it carried a weight that made his chest tighten. She wore a simple yellow dress that brought out the warmth in her skin, and her hair fell in natural curls around her shoulders. She was beautiful, had always been beautiful, but there was something different about her now, something that spoke of battles fought and won, of a woman who'd found her power in places he'd never thought to look. Amara. Her name felt foreign on his lips after so much silence. You look." He stopped, realizing that everything he wanted to say was tangled up with everything he couldn't say. "Different," she supplied, and there was the ghost of a smile at the corner of her mouth, the same smile that had once undone him completely. "Beautiful," he said before he could stop himself. "You look beautiful." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Michael gestured toward the seating area near the windows, a cluster of leather chairs arranged around a glass table that was meant to impress visitors and clients. It felt absurdly formal for this moment, but he didn't trust himself to suggest somewhere more private. As they sat, Michael noticed the way Amara's fingers worried the strap of her purse, a tell he remembered from their time together. She was nervous, which meant whatever had brought her here wasn't casual. "How have you been?" he asked, the question feeling both essential and completely inadequate. "Good," she said, then paused. "Busy. Very busy, actually." Something in her tone made him look at her more carefully. There was a story in her eyes, something significant she was working up to saying. He'd spent enough time reading people in business to recognize when someone was gathering courage. Michael, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you a long time ago, but... She took a deep breath, her hands stilling on her purse. But you left before I had the chance. The words hit him like a physical blow. He remembered that last night, the way he'd cut her off when she'd tried to speak, too caught up in his own fear to hear what she'd been trying to say. Amara, Please, she said quietly. Let me finish. I've been practicing this conversation for 3 years. He nodded, though something cold was settling in his stomach. When you told me you couldn't do this anymore, that what we had was too intense, too complicated. She paused, her voice catching slightly. I was going to tell you that I was pregnant. The world tilted. Michael felt as though the marble floor beneath his feet had suddenly become liquid. Pregnant, he repeated, the word feeling foreign in his mouth. 10 weeks, she continued, her voice growing stronger. I'd found out that morning. I was scared, but I was also happy. I thought we could figure it out together. I thought you'd want to know. Michael's mind reeled, trying to process what she was telling him. A baby, he said slowly. You had a baby. Amara's smile was soft and complicated. 3 babies, actually. Triplets. The word hit him like a thunderclap. Triplets. 2 boys and a girl. They are almost 6 now. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, scrolling to what was obviously a recent photo. Liam, Maya, and Zoe. Michael stared at the screen, at 3 small faces that looked back at him with expressions he was only beginning to recognize. The girl had Amara's smile and his eyes. One of the boys had his jawline but Amara's expressive eyebrows. The other boy looked like a perfect blend of both of them, as if genetics had decided to create a living reminder of what they'd once been together. They are. He couldn't finish the sentence. Beautiful. Perfect. His. The reality was too enormous to fit into words. They are wonderful, Amara said softly. They are smart and funny and challenging and completely worth every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, every time I wondered if I was strong enough to do this alone. The last words cut deep. Alone. She'd done this alone because he'd walked away before she could tell him. Because his fear had been stronger than his love. What would you do if you discovered you had children you never knew existed? How do you think it feels to raise children alone when their father chose to leave? Why didn't you call? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't you try to reach me after I left? Amara's expression hardened slightly. You made it very clear that you wanted out, Michael. You didn't just end our relationship, you ended us. Completely. When someone tells you they can't handle what you have together, when they walk away like what you shared meant nothing. She shook her head. I wasn't going to force you into being a father any more than I was going to force you into loving me. The accusation in her words was gentle but devastating. He had walked away. He had made it clear that he wanted no part of whatever future they might have built together. But they are my children, he said, the words sounding strange even as he spoke them. Biologically, yes, Amara said. But Michael, they don't know you exist. That statement hit him harder than anything else she'd said. Somewhere in Atlanta, 3 children who shared his DNA were living their lives without any knowledge of him. They had birthday parties and scraped knees and bedtime stories and Christmas mornings, and he was a stranger to all of it. You never told them about me. What was I supposed to say? Amara's voice carried 3 years of justified anger. Your father decided he didn't want us before he knew you existed. Daddy chose his comfortable life over the complicated one that included you. Each word was a deserved blow, and Michael absorbed them in silence. I told them that some families look different, she continued. That they have me, and they have each other, and that's what makes us complete. I wasn't going to let them grow up feeling like they were missing something just because the man who helped create them wasn't brave enough to stick around. The silence stretched between them, filled with 3 years of missed birthdays, first words, first steps, and 1,000 other moments that Michael was only now realizing he'd lost forever. Why are you telling me now? He finally asked. Amara looked out the window, watching the flow of downtown traffic. Because they are starting to ask questions I can't answer anymore. Because Liam has your eyes and Maya has your stubborn streak, and Zoe has your way of tilting her head when she's thinking. Because they deserve to know where they come from, even if. She turned back to him. Even if you still don't want to be part of where they are going. I want to see them, Michael said immediately, the words surprising even him with their certainty. Amara studied his face carefully. Want to see them, or feel obligated to see them? There's a difference, Michael, and my children deserve better than obligation. He thought about the photo on her phone, about 3 small faces that were half him and half the woman he'd never really stopped loving. He thought about the life he'd built in their absence, successful, clean, uncomplicated, and realized it had also been empty in ways he'd spent 3 years trying not to acknowledge. I want to know them, he said, and for the first time in the conversation, his voice carried absolute conviction. I want to know who they are, what they like, what makes them laugh. I want to know if Liam is as serious as he looks in that photo, if Maya really has my stubborn streak, if Zoe inherited your way of seeing magic in ordinary things. Amara's expression softened slightly. It's not going to be simple, Michael. You can't just walk into their lives and expect them to understand who you are. They've been fine without you. They don't need you. They want you as something you'd have to earn. I understand. Do you? She leaned forward slightly. Because this isn't a business deal you can negotiate or a problem you can solve with money. These are children who've learned that family means the people who show up every day, not the people who share your genes. If you're going to do this, you have to be all in. No walking away when it gets complicated or scary or inconvenient. Michael met her eyes, seeing in them both the woman he'd fallen in love with and the mother she'd become in his absence. I walked away once, he said quietly. It was the biggest mistake of my life. I won't make it again. Something shifted in Amara's expression, not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the first crack in the wall she'd built around herself and her children. They are outside, she said softly. Outside. Michael's heart lurched. Here. Now. In my car in the parking garage. I thought. She took a deep breath. I thought if this conversation went well, maybe they could meet you. If it didn't go well, I could drive away and they'd never know how close they came to meeting their father. Michael stood abruptly, his composed businessman facade finally cracking completely. They are here. My children are here. Our children, Amara corrected gently. And yes, they are here. The question is, are you ready to meet them? Michael looked at this woman who'd carried his children alone, who'd built a family from love and determination, who'd been brave enough to come here today despite everything he'd put her through. He thought about the empty penthouse he'd returned to tonight, about the pristine life he'd constructed that had room for everything except the things that actually mattered. I've been ready for 3 years, he said. I just didn't know it. Amara stood as well, studying his face one more time. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded. Okay, she said simply. Let's go meet your children. As they walked toward the elevator that would take them to the parking garage, Michael felt as though he was stepping into a completely different life, one where his carefully constructed walls didn't matter, where his fear couldn't protect him, where 3 small people he'd never met were about to redefine everything he thought he knew about love, family, and what it meant to be brave enough to stay. The elevator doors closed behind them, and Michael Harrison, successful businessman, careful planner, man who'd spent 3 years running from the most important thing that had ever happened to him, prepared to meet the future he'd never known he'd lost, and might finally be ready to claim. The parking garage of Harrison Pharmaceuticals had never felt so significant. As the elevator descended into the concrete cavern, Michael's reflection multiplied in the metal surfaces around him. A man about to step into the most important moment of his life, repeated infinitely in distorted chrome and steel. Amara stood beside him, her phone buzzing with what he assumed was a text message. She glanced at it and smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression he'd seen from her since she'd appeared in his lobby. Maya wants to know if we're coming back soon because Liam is hogging the tablet and Zoe spilled juice on her coloring book, she said, her voice carrying the familiar exasperation of a mother managing small crises from a distance. The mundane nature of the text struck Michael like a revelation. These children, his children, had normal problems, normal squabbles, normal moments that made up the fabric of daily life. They weren't abstract concepts or photographs on a phone screen. They were real people with personalities and preferences and the kind of immediate needs that couldn't wait for their father to finish processing the earth-shattering discovery of their existence. What do I say to them? He asked as the elevator reached the parking level. Amara looked at him thoughtfully. What do you want to say to them? Everything, he said immediately. I want to know everything about them. What they dream about, what makes them laugh, what they are afraid of, whether they like pancakes or waffles, if they've lost any teeth yet, whether they can ride bikes. He stopped, realizing he was rambling. Michael, Amara said gently, they are 5 years old. Start with hello. The elevator doors opened into the dimly lit garage, and Michael followed Amara through rows of expensive cars toward a modest blue Honda Civic parked near the back. As they approached, he could see movement in the backseat, small shadows shifting behind tinted windows, completely unaware that their entire world was about to change. Amara paused beside the driver's door, her hand on the handle. Before we do this, I need you to understand something. These children are my entire world. They are happy, secure, and loved. If you can't be what they need, if you're going to disappoint them or hurt them or decide this is too complicated after all, now is the time to walk away. Once they know who you are, there's no taking it back. Michael met her eyes, seeing in them the fierce protectiveness of a mother who'd fought every battle alone and won. I'm not walking away, Amara. Not from them, and not from you. Something flickered in her expression at the last part, but before she could respond, a small voice from inside the car called out, Mama, is this taking forever on purpose? Amara smiled despite herself. That's Zoe. She doesn't have much patience for adult conversations. She opened the door, and suddenly Michael was looking at them. 3 small people who shared his DNA but were complete strangers, buckled into car seats with juice boxes and coloring books, looking at him with curious expressions that made his chest tight. Guys, I want you to meet someone very special, Amara said, her voice taking on the careful tone parents use when they are about to deliver news that will change everything. This is Michael. 3 pairs of eyes studied him with the unabashed directness that only children possess. The boy on the left, Liam, Michael remembered, had serious dark eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that made him look older than 5. Maya, in the middle, tilted her head in a gesture so familiar it took Michael's breath away. He'd seen that exact expression in mirrors his entire life. And Zoe, with her wild curls and bright smile, waved at him with the unself-conscious friendliness of a child who hadn't yet learned that some strangers might not wave back. Hi, Michael said, his voice coming out rougher than he'd intended. It's really nice to meet you. Are you Mama's friend? Maya asked, her directness catching him off guard. Michael glanced at Amara, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Yes, I'm your Mama's friend. We knew each other before you were born. Are you old friends or new friends? Liam asked, pushing his glasses up his nose in a gesture that was purely his own but somehow reminded Michael of his own father. Old friends, Amara said when Michael hesitated. Very old friends. Zoe had been studying Michael with the intense concentration children reserve for puzzles they are trying to solve. You have the same eyes as me, she announced suddenly. The observation hit Michael like a physical blow. He looked at Zoe's face, really looked, and saw his own blue eyes staring back at him from features that were unmistakably Amara's. It was like looking at a living bridge between his past and a future he'd never imagined. I do, he said softly. That's a very good observation. I'm good at observations, Zoe said proudly. Mama says I notice things other people miss. She gets that from you, Amara said quietly, and Michael realized she was watching his face carefully, cataloguing his reactions to each child. Can I ask you guys something? Michael said, crouching down so he was at their eye level. 3 small heads nodded in unison. What are your favorite things to do? The question opened floodgates. Liam liked building with blocks and reading books about dinosaurs. Maya loved to draw and could do a cartwheel. She offered to demonstrate, right there in the parking garage. Zoe was learning to play piano and could already play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star with both hands. As they talked, Michael found himself cataloguing details he'd never realized he was hungry for. Maya had a small scar on her chin from falling off her bike last summer. Liam wore his glasses because he was nearsighted, just like Michael had been as a child. Zoe had paint under her fingernails because she'd been working on a picture of their family that morning. Can we see your office? Maya asked suddenly. Mama said you work in this big building. Michael looked to Amara, who shrugged. If you want to show them, that's fine. But we can't stay long, they haven't had lunch yet. Would you like to see where I work? Michael asked the children, and was rewarded with 3 enthusiastic nods. 20 minutes later, Michael found himself in his pristine corner office watching his children. The words still felt surreal. Explore the space with unbridled curiosity. Maya had immediately gravitated toward the windows, pressing her nose against the glass to look down at the city below. Liam was examining the diplomas on his wall with the serious attention of someone trying to decode their meaning. And Zoe had discovered his desk chair and was spinning in slow circles, her delighted giggles filling a space that had never heard children's laughter. How do you think it feels to see your space through a child's eyes for the first time? What makes a house a home versus just a place where someone lives? This is really high up, Maya observed from the window. Do you ever get scared being so high? Sometimes, Michael admitted, joining her at the window. But the view is worth it. We live in an apartment, she said matter-of-factly. But it's not high like this. Mama says high places are just different, not better. Michael glanced at Amara, who was watching their daughter with an expression he couldn't quite read. There was pride there, and love, but also something that looked like protection, as if she was ready to step in if he said or did anything that might hurt Maya's perfectly constructed worldview. Your mama is very smart, Michael said. Different doesn't mean better or worse. It just means different. Liam had moved from the diplomas to the bookshelf, running his finger along the spines of business texts and legal documents. Do you read all these books? Most of them, Michael said. Though I bet the books you read are more interesting. I like books about dinosaurs, Liam said seriously. Did you know that velociraptors were actually much smaller than they show in movies? And they had feathers. Michael found himself genuinely engaged in a conversation about paleontology with a 5-year-old who clearly knew more about dinosaurs than he did. As Liam explained the difference between herbivores and carnivores, Michael caught Amara's eye across the room. She was smiling, not the careful, protective smile she'd worn in the lobby, but something warmer and more real. He's been obsessed with dinosaurs since he was 3, she said. Last year for Halloween, he wanted to be a paleontologist. Not a dinosaur, a paleontologist. Complete with khaki vest and magnifying glass. That's very specific, Michael said, and Liam nodded gravely. I want to dig up fossils when I grow up, Liam explained. Mama says I have to go to college first, but then I can dig up dinosaurs in the desert. Michael felt something twist in his chest, the realization that this serious little boy was making plans for a future that Michael had never imagined he'd be part of. College seemed impossibly far away and terrifyingly close at the same time. Zoe had abandoned the spinning chair and was now examining the few personal items on Michael's desk, a paperweight from a business conference, a fountain pen his father had given him, and a small crystal award from his first successful pharmaceutical patent. Why don't you have any pictures? She asked with the blunt curiosity of childhood. Michael looked at his desk through her eyes and realized she was right. The entire office was devoid of personal photographs, family mementos, or anything that spoke to a life beyond quarterly reports and merger documents. I guess I never thought to put any up, he said honestly. Mama has pictures everywhere, Zoe announced. Pictures of us and our grandma and our friends from school and our goldfish, Mr. Bubbles. You have a goldfish named Mr. Bubbles. Had, Maya corrected from the window. He went to fish heaven last month. But Mama says we can get another fish when we're ready. Michael found himself thinking about the things these children had experienced that he'd missed. Pets, birthdays, Christmas mornings, scraped knees that needed kissing, bedtime stories, and 1,000 other moments that made up the texture of childhood. 3 years of their lives had passed without him, and he was a stranger to all of it. As if sensing his thoughts, Amara moved closer. It's a lot, she said quietly while the children continued exploring. I keep thinking about everything I missed, Michael admitted. Their first words, first steps, first everything. Liam's first word was book, Amara said softly. Maya's was more. She's never been satisfied with just enough of anything. And Zoe's first word was mama, which she said while looking directly at me like she'd been waiting her whole life to tell me something important. Each detail was a gift and a wound at the same time. Michael was grateful to know these things and devastated to have missed them. I can't change the past, he said. But I want to be part of their future, if you'll let me. Amara studied his face. What does that look like to you, Michael? Because being part of their future isn't just showing up for the fun parts. It's school events and doctor appointments and temper tantrums and homework battles and all the ordinary, difficult, beautiful work of raising children. Before Michael could answer, Zoe appeared at his elbow, tugging on his sleeve. Michael, do you want to see my picture? She held up a piece of paper that had been folded and unfolded so many times it was soft at the creases. It was clearly the family picture she'd mentioned earlier, 4 figures drawn in crayon, standing in front of a house with a yellow door and flowers in the yard. That's me. Zoe pointed to the smallest figure, which had wild curly hair and a huge smile. And that's Maya, and that's Liam, and that's Mama. We're a family. Michael looked at the drawing, at the way Zoe had positioned them all close together, their stick-figure hands touching. It was complete unto itself, a family that had learned to be whole without him. It's beautiful, he said, and meant it. Do you want to be in our family picture? Zoe asked with the casual directness that only children possess. The question hung in the air like a butterfly that might startle away if anyone moved too quickly. Michael looked at Amara, whose expression had gone carefully neutral. Zoe, baby, Amara said gently, that's a big question. But he has the same eyes as me, Zoe said, as if this settled everything. And he's nice. And Mama said he's an old friend, and old friends are like family, right? Michael knelt down to Zoe's level, this little girl who had no idea she'd just asked the most important question of his life. I would love to be in your family picture, he said softly. If your Mama says it's okay, and if you and Liam and Maya want me there. Maya had abandoned her post at the window and joined them, studying Michael with the serious expression he was beginning to recognize as her thinking face. Are you going to stay this time? She asked. The question hit him like cold water. This time? Mama's friends sometimes go away and don't come back, Maya explained matter-of-factly. I just want to know if you're the staying kind of friend or the going-away kind. Michael felt Amara's eyes on him, felt the weight of 3 years of single motherhood and the protective walls she'd built around their children's hearts. This was the test, he realized, not whether he could charm them or win them over, but whether he could promise them something they could count on. I'm the staying kind, he said, looking directly at Maya, then at each of her siblings. I promise you that I'm the staying kind of friend. Liam, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange, pushed his glasses up his nose and nodded solemnly. Good, he said simply. Because Zoe cries when people go away, even though she pretends she doesn't. I do not. Zoe protested, but her cheeks flushed pink. It's okay to cry when people go away, Michael said gently. It means you care about them. And I promise you won't have to cry about me leaving. As the words left his mouth, Michael realized he was making a commitment that went far beyond what he'd planned when he'd walked into his office that morning. He was promising these children, his children, that he would be present, consistent, reliable. He was promising to be the father they deserved, not just the biological contributor to their existence. Amara's phone buzzed again, and she glanced at it with the expression of a mother whose carefully planned day was running longer than expected. We need to get going, she said. Lunch, then naps, then Maya has gymnastics at 3. The return to normal schedule felt both jarring and grounding. These children had lives that continued beyond this momentous meeting, routines that mattered, commitments that had to be kept. Can Michael come to lunch with us? Zoe asked, and Michael's heart lurched with want and terror in equal measure. Amara looked at him, her expression unreadable. Do you want to come to lunch with us? It was such a simple question with such complicated implications. Lunch would mean being in their world instead of his. It would mean car seats and high chairs and spilled juice and the kind of chaos that his carefully ordered life had never accommodated. I would love that, he said without hesitation. As they gathered up Zoe's coloring book and Liam's dinosaur fact cards and Maya's various observations about his office, Michael realized that everything was about to change. His pristine penthouse, his controlled schedule, his life measured in quarterly reports and board meetings, all of it suddenly felt like preparation for something he was only now beginning to understand. Michael, Zoe said as they waited for the elevator, will you come to my piano recital? It's next week, and I'm playing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star for everyone. I wouldn't miss it, he said, and realized he meant it completely. As the elevator doors closed around them, Michael, Amara, and 3 children who were about to teach him everything he didn't know about love, family, and what it meant to stay, he understood that he was leaving behind the man who had walked away 3 years ago and becoming someone entirely new. Someone who stayed. The restaurant Amara chose was a small family diner 3 blocks from her apartment. The kind of place with laminated menus, booster seats stacked by the door, and the relaxed chaos that comes with being genuinely child-friendly. Michael had driven behind them in his BMW, following Amara's Honda through parts of Atlanta he rarely visited, neighborhoods where children played in front yards and families gathered on porches that had seen decades of ordinary, extraordinary life. As they settled into a corner booth, the children arguing over who got to sit next to Michael with an intensity that both thrilled and overwhelmed him. He realized he'd never eaten in a place like this. His meals were usually solitary affairs in upscale restaurants or business lunches in private dining rooms where the only sounds were the clink of silverware against china and carefully modulated conversation about quarterly projections. Here, Maya was explaining why she only ate mac and cheese if it was the kind that came from a box. The restaurant kind tastes too fancy. While Liam methodically arranged his chicken nuggets in order of size before eating them, and Zoe was conducting an elaborate negotiation about whether she could have chocolate milk if she promised to drink regular milk tomorrow. They are very specific about their food preferences, Amara said, sliding into the booth beside Zoe with the practiced ease of a mother who'd navigated thousands of these restaurant moments alone. I can see that, Michael said, watching Liam's nugget arrangement with fascination. Is there a system to the organization? Biggest to smallest, Liam explained seriously. It's more efficient. He's been doing that since he could hold a chicken nugget, Amara said, and there was such tenderness in her voice that Michael felt something twist in his chest. 3 years of these small, precious details that he'd missed completely. The server appeared, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who clearly knew them well. The usual for everyone, she asked, then noticed Michael. Oh, we have someone new today. This is Michael, Maya announced before anyone else could speak. His mama's old friend, and he has the same eyes as Zoe, and he works in a really tall building. Well, hello, Michael, the server said with the warmth of someone accustomed to children's introduction style. What can I get for you? Michael realized he'd been so focused on watching his children that he hadn't even looked at the menu. What do you recommend? Daddy, just get chicken nuggets like us, Zoe exclaimed, and the word hit the table like a small bomb. The silence that followed was deafening. Zoe looked around at the suddenly frozen faces, her own expression shifting from excitement to confusion to the dawning realization that she'd said something significant. I mean, she started, her bottom lip beginning to tremble. Michael's heart shattered and soared simultaneously. This little girl had called him Daddy, the word he'd never heard applied to himself, the title he'd never imagined claiming, and she was about to cry because she thought she'd made a mistake. Chicken nuggets sound perfect, he said gently, not breaking eye contact with Zoe. What kind of sauce do you recommend? The relief that flooded Zoe's face was immediate and complete. Ranch. Always ranch. Ketchup is for babies. Ranch it is, Michael said, and the conversation resumed as if the most momentous word in the English language hadn't just been spoken by a 5-year-old with paint under her fingernails. But Amara had gone very still beside Zoe, and Michael could feel the weight of that single word settling between them like something that would need to be addressed, eventually, when small ears weren't listening. As they waited for food, the children regaled Michael with stories from their life. The time Maya had convinced a substitute teacher that they had a pet dinosaur at home. Liam's ongoing battle with a classmate named Tucker who insisted that T-Rex couldn't actually roar, and Zoe's recent discovery that she could wiggle her ears but only when she was concentrating very hard. Michael found himself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in months, maybe years. These children were funny, clever, and completely unfiltered in the way that only children could be. They asked him questions about everything: why his watch was so shiny, whether he'd ever been in an airplane, if he knew how to ride a bicycle, whether he was married. The last question came from Maya, delivered with the casual directness he was learning was her trademark. Are you married, Michael? No, he said simply. I'm not married. Why not? Liam asked, looking up from his carefully arranged nuggets. I guess I never found the right person to marry, Michael said, acutely aware of Amara's presence beside him. Mama's not married either, Zoe announced. She says she's too busy taking care of us to worry about finding a husband. Michael glanced at Amara, whose cheeks had flushed slightly. That's not exactly what I said. You said you had your hands full with us, Maya corrected. Same thing. Not quite the same thing, Amara murmured, but she was smiling. The food arrived, and Michael discovered that chicken nuggets with ranch dressing in a crowded diner could be the best meal he'd ever eaten, if only because he was sharing it with 3 small people who thought his terrible jokes were hilarious and who argued over whether he was sitting close enough to Maya to count as next to her. Halfway through lunch, Michael's phone started buzzing. He ignored it the first few times, but when it continued persistently, Amara noticed. If you need to take that. It can wait, Michael said firmly. Whatever emergency had erupted at Harrison Pharmaceuticals could damn well wait until after lunch with his children. But the phone kept buzzing, and finally Liam looked at him seriously. That sounds important. Michael glanced at the screen and saw Patricia's name. She wouldn't call repeatedly unless something truly urgent had happened. "Excuse me for just 1 minute," he said, stepping away from the table. "Mr. Harrison, thank God." Patricia's voice was strained. "We have a situation. The Henderson Industries merger, they are pulling out. Effective immediately. They are claiming breach of contract, and their lawyers are demanding the penalty fees. We're talking about $40 million, and they want it resolved by 5 o'clock today or they are filing lawsuits." Michael felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with corporate crisis management. $40 million. Breach of contract claims. The kind of business emergency that had always commanded his complete attention and immediate action. Did they specify what breach they are claiming? Something about due diligence timelines not being met. "Mr. Harrison, you need to get back here immediately. The lawyers are already on their way, and the board is calling an emergency meeting." Michael looked back at the table where his children were debating whether chocolate chip cookies or ice cream made a better dessert, where Amara was patiently helping Zoe wipe branch dressing off her fingers, where 3 small people were living their lives completely unaware that their father was facing a professional crisis that could reshape his entire company. 3 months ago, he would have been back in his car before Patricia finished explaining the situation. 3 hours ago, he might have done the same thing. But now, watching Maya demonstrate her cartwheel technique in the narrow space beside their booth while Liam provided commentary and Zoe cheered, he found himself saying something that surprised even him. "Handle the initial response. Tell the lawyers I'll be there in 2 hours." 2 hours. "Mr. Harrison, this is..." 2 hours, Patricia. "I trust you to manage things until then." He hung up and returned to the table, where Zoe immediately launched into an explanation of why vanilla ice cream was objectively superior to chocolate. "Everything okay?" Amara asked quietly. "Work emergency," Michael said. "But it can wait." Amara studied his face. "How big of an emergency?" "The kind that used to define my entire existence," he said honestly. "But today, it doesn't feel like the most important thing happening." Something shifted in Amara's expression, a wall coming down, perhaps, or maybe just a door opening a crack. They finished lunch with ice cream, vanilla, as per Zoe's recommendation, and chocolate chip cookies, Maya's compromise position, and as they prepared to leave, Michael realized that this ordinary meal in a neighborhood diner had been the most extraordinary few hours of his adult life. In the parking lot, as Amara buckled the children back into their car seats, Maya tugged on Michael's sleeve. "Are you coming to our house?" she asked. "If your mama says it's okay. Can we show him our rooms?" Liam asked. "And the goldfish tank where Mr. Bubbles used to live. And my piano." Zoe added. "I can play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star for you." Michael looked at Amara over the children's heads. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You have a work emergency," she said softly. "I have something more important," he replied. "What would you choose if you had to pick between a career-defining moment and being present for your family? How do we decide what truly matters when everything feels urgent?" The drive to Amara's apartment took them through tree-lined neighborhoods where kids rode bikes on sidewalks and families worked in gardens that showed the patient care of people who intended to stay. Michael followed the Honda, his phone buzzing constantly with calls and texts he didn't answer, his mind cycling between the crisis waiting at his office and the children chattering in the car ahead of him. Amara's apartment building was modest but well-maintained, with a small playground out front where children were already gathering for after-school play. As they climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, Michael could hear normal life happening behind other doors, television shows, conversation, a baby crying, someone practicing violin. "Home sweet home," Amara said, unlocking the door to apartment 2B. Michael stepped into a space that was the complete opposite of his sterile penthouse. The walls were painted warm colors and covered with children's artwork, family photos, and a hand-lettered sign that read, "In this house, we do love, laughter, and really loud singing." The furniture was comfortable rather than expensive, chosen for durability and function rather than impression. Toys were organized in colorful bins, books filled shelves at child height, and everything spoke of a life lived fully rather than displayed. "It's perfect," Michael said, and meant it. "It's small," Amara said, "but it's ours." The children immediately scattered to show Michael their treasures, Liam's dinosaur book collection, Maya's art corner where she kept her drawing supplies, Zoe's keyboard set up in the living room where she could practice while still being part of family activity. "This is where we read stories," Maya said, pointing to a worn armchair surrounded by pillows. "Mama reads to us every night before bed." "Every night?" "Every single night," Zoe confirmed. "Even when she's tired or we've been bad. She says stories are medicine for everything." Michael looked at Amara, who was watching her children show off their home with the quiet pride of someone who'd built something meaningful from nothing but love and determination. His phone rang again. This time, it was his personal assistant, which meant the crisis had escalated beyond Patricia's ability to handle it alone. "I should probably take this," he said reluctantly. "Use the kitchen," Amara suggested. "It's quieter." The call confirmed his worst fears. Henderson Industries wasn't just pulling out of the merger. They were claiming fraud, alleging that Michael had deliberately withheld information during due diligence. It wasn't true, but proving it would require Michael's immediate attention, and the window for resolution was closing rapidly. "Sir, you need to be here," his assistant said. "This could destroy the company if we don't handle it correctly." Michael closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of corporate responsibility settling on his shoulders. This was exactly the kind of crisis that had always taken precedence over everything else in his life. The kind of situation that had taught him to prioritize professional obligations over personal relationships, business success over emotional fulfillment. Through the kitchen doorway, he could see Zoe at her little piano, pecking out the melody of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star with intense concentration, while Liam provided dinosaur facts as musical accompaniment and Maya drew what appeared to be their lunch adventure on a piece of construction paper. This was the choice, he realized. The same choice he'd been making for his entire adult life, just dressed up in new circumstances. He could leave now, handle the crisis, save his company, and probably lose any chance of being part of this family that had somehow become more important than anything he'd ever built in a boardroom. Or he could stay, let his assistants and lawyers handle what they could, accept whatever consequences came from putting his children first, and trust that some things were more valuable than quarterly profits. "Handle it," he said into the phone. "Whatever it takes, handle it. I'll be there tonight to deal with the aftermath." "Sir, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Michael said, looking through the doorway at three children who were learning to trust him. "Some things can't wait, and some things can. This can wait." He hung up and turned his phone completely off. When he returned to the living room, Zoe was in the middle of her performance, her tongue sticking out slightly in concentration as she navigated the trickier parts of the melody. When she finished, she looked up expectantly. "That was beautiful," Michael said, and her smile could have powered the entire city. "Do you want to learn?" she asked. "I can teach you. Mama says I'm a very good teacher." "I would love to learn." As Michael sat beside his daughter at her tiny piano, his large hands awkward on the small keys, his phone dark and silent in his pocket while his company possibly burned, he realized that for the first time in his adult life, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. But the afternoon was far from over, and the real test of his commitment was still to come. 2 hours later, as they sat on the living room floor building an elaborate dinosaur habitat out of blocks, Liam's design, Maya's artistic touches, Zoe's sound effects, Amara's phone rang. She glanced at it and her expression changed immediately. "It's the school," she said, answering quickly. "Hello. What? When? Is she okay?" Michael watched Amara's face go pale as she listened to whatever the caller was telling her. "I'll be right there," she said, hanging up with shaking hands. Maya's teacher just called. There was an incident on the playground. Another child pushed her off the monkey bars. They think she might have broken her wrist. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Maya was at after-school care, not with them, and she was hurt. "I have to go get her and take her to the emergency room," Amara said, already reaching for her keys and purse. "Liam, Zoe, we need to." "I'll drive," Michael said immediately. "You're shaking. You don't understand. This could take hours. Emergency rooms with kids, the waiting, the chaos." "I understand that Maya is hurt and she needs us," Michael said firmly. "All of us. Together." Amara looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her weighing whether to trust him with this, the real, messy, terrifying part of parenthood where children get hurt and everything else stops mattering. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay, let's go get our daughter." As they rushed out of the apartment, Liam and Zoe unusually quiet with worry. Michael realized that Amara had said our daughter. Not my daughter or Maya, but our daughter. And for the first time since he'd learned of their existence, he truly felt like a father. The real test was just beginning. The children's emergency room at Atlanta General Hospital was a study in controlled chaos. Bright murals on the walls depicting cheerful animals that couldn't quite mask the underlying tension of worried parents and crying children. The efficient bustle of medical staff who'd learned to project calm authority in the face of childhood crises, and the particular kind of waiting that happens when someone you love is in pain. Maya sat in Michael's lap in the hard plastic chair, her left wrist wrapped in a temporary splint, her face streaked with tears she was trying very hard not to let fall. She'd been brave when they'd found her in the school nurse's office, brave during the car ride to the hospital, brave through the initial examination, but now, in the fluorescent-lit waiting room while they waited for X-ray results, her composure was finally cracking. "It hurts, Daddy," she whispered against his chest, and the word hit him like a physical blow every time she said it. "I know, sweetheart," Michael murmured, stroking her hair with one hand while keeping his other arm carefully positioned to support her injured wrist. "The doctor is going to make it feel better soon." Amara sat beside them, Liam curled against her side and Zoe in her lap, all of them maintaining the kind of vigilant quiet that families develop during medical emergencies. She'd been watching Michael carefully since they'd arrived. He'd noticed, cataloging how he handled each moment, each small crisis within the larger crisis. When Maya had sobbed during the initial examination, Michael had been the one to distract her with a story about a brave princess who could defeat dragons even with a hurt arm. When Liam had grown anxious about whether his sister would be okay, Michael had sat with him in the hallway and explained exactly what X-rays were and why they didn't hurt. When Zoe had announced she was hungry and bored and wanted to go home, Michael had somehow produced a package of crackers from the vending machine and turned waiting into a game of I Spy that had all three children giggling despite their worry. "Mr. Harrison." A nurse appeared with a clipboard. "The doctor would like to speak with you and Mrs. Collins about Maya's X-rays." "I'll stay with them," Michael said immediately, but Amara shook her head. "We should both hear this. Maya, can you sit with Liam and Zoe for a minute while Mama and Daddy talk to the doctor?" The casual use of Daddy in that context, not from the children, but from Amara herself, sent something warm and terrifying straight through Michael's chest. Maya nodded solemnly and transferred herself to the chair between her siblings, taking her role as temporary big sister seriously. Dr. Rodriguez was a young woman with kind eyes and the sort of reassuring manner that came from years of delivering news to worried parents. "Maya has a hairline fracture in her radius. That's one of the bones in her forearm," she explained, pointing to the X-ray images on her tablet. "It's actually very common in children her age, and the good news is that children's bones heal remarkably well." "How long will she be in a cast?" Amara asked, her voice steady but Michael could see her hands shaking slightly. 6 to 8 weeks. "We'll put her in a fiberglass cast today. She gets to pick the color. No gym class or playground equipment for the duration, but she can still do most normal activities. Piano lessons, art projects, all of that should be fine." Michael felt a relief so profound it left him slightly dizzy. 6 weeks in a cast was an inconvenience, not a tragedy. Maya would heal completely, would be back to cartwheels and monkey bars before summer ended. "Any questions?" Dr. Rodriguez asked. "Will it hurt?" Michael found himself asking. "The cast, I mean. Will she be in pain?" The doctor smiled. "Some discomfort for the first few days, but children are amazingly resilient. Keep her comfortable with children's ibuprofen, and she'll probably forget about it within a week. The hardest part will be keeping her from trying to scratch inside the cast." 20 minutes later, Maya was the proud owner of a bright purple cast that she'd decorated with stickers of dinosaurs, Liam's contribution, flowers, her own choice, and musical notes, Zoe's addition. The injury that had seemed so frightening an hour ago had transformed into something approaching an adventure, especially when the doctor explained that her friends could sign the cast at school. "Can Daddy sign it first?" Maya asked as they prepared to leave the hospital. "If he wants to," Amara said, looking at Michael with an expression he couldn't quite read. Michael accepted the marker from the nurse and carefully wrote, "Get well soon, brave girl. Love, Daddy," in his best handwriting on the purple fiberglass, and realized he was signing his name to something far more significant than a cast. The drive home was quiet, all three children exhausted from the emotional intensity of the afternoon. Maya dozed against Michael's shoulder in the backseat. They'd moved car seats around so he could sit with her, while Liam and Zoe flanked them, the four of them fitting together in the Honda's backseat like pieces of a puzzle that had finally found their proper configuration. "Thank you," Amara said softly as they pulled into the apartment complex parking lot. "For what?" "For staying. For being exactly what they needed today." Michael looked down at Maya, sleeping peacefully despite her cast. Her face finally relaxed after hours of trying to be brave. "I told you I was the staying kind." "You did," Amara said. "But saying it and proving it are different things." As they carried sleeping children upstairs and tucked them into their beds, Maya requiring extra pillows to prop up her cast, Liam needing his dinosaur night light, Zoe insisting on a good-night song despite being half asleep, Michael found himself moving through the routines of bedtime with surprising ease. Amara showed him where everything was kept, but somehow he already understood the rhythm of it. The careful negotiation of bedtime stories, the last drinks of water, the checking under beds for monsters, Zoe's nightly requirement, the gentle but firm insistence that yes, it really was time to sleep now. "You're good at this," Amara said as they closed Zoe's door and tiptoed back to the living room. "I had good teachers today," Michael said, settling onto the couch beside her. "Those three are pretty amazing kids." "They are," Amara agreed. "They are also your kids, Michael. Completely and legally and biologically yours, if you want them to be." The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that went far beyond what had been spoken aloud during the day's events. "What are you saying?" Amara turned to face him fully. "I'm saying that what happened today, the way you dropped everything for Maya, the way you've stepped into this chaos and made it work, the way they've all started calling you daddy like it's the most natural thing in the world, that's not temporary, is it? You're not just visiting their lives. You want to be their father." "More than I've ever wanted anything," Michael said without hesitation. "Even if it means your work suffers. Even if it means your perfectly organized life gets turned upside down by school plays and soccer practice and teenage drama. Even if it means sometimes choosing them over deals and mergers and whatever crisis is happening at Harrison Pharmaceuticals." Michael thought about his phone, which he'd turned back on briefly in the hospital parking lot and immediately turned off again, after seeing 4 to 7 missed calls and texts. He thought about the Henderson Industries merger, which had probably imploded completely by now. He thought about the company he'd spent years building, the reputation he'd carefully constructed, the life he'd believed was the measure of his success. "Especially then," he said. "Amara, I walked away from you 3 years ago because I was terrified of how much I loved you, how much I needed you, how completely you'd changed what I thought I wanted from life. I convinced myself I was protecting us both from something that was too intense to last." Amara's expression softened. "And now I know that love isn't something you protect yourself from. It's something you protect. And I want to protect this, us, them, whatever we're building here. I want to be their father, not just their donor. I want to be part of their lives in every way that matters." "What about us?" Amara asked quietly. "Because Michael, I need to know where I fit in this picture you're painting. Are you here for them, or are you here for all of us?" The question he'd been avoiding all day finally demanded an answer. Michael looked at this woman who'd raised his children alone, who'd built a family from love and determination, who'd been brave enough to come find him today despite everything he'd put her through. "I never stopped loving you," he said simply. "I convinced myself I had, built a whole life around the idea that I was better off without you. But the truth is that every day for 3 years, I've wondered what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to stay. And now you know," Amara said softly. "Now I know that I would have had everything I didn't realize I wanted. A family, children who call me daddy, a woman who loves me enough to let me prove I can be better than the man who walked away." Amara was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. "It won't be easy, Michael. Blending our lives, figuring out how to be co-parents, dealing with all the practical things like custody and school decisions and whether you want them to take your name." "I want all of it," Michael said. "The easy parts and the hard parts and everything in between. I want to be here for piano recitals and broken bones and first days of school and driver's licenses and college graduations and whatever comes after that. I want to love you and them with the kind of commitment that doesn't waver when things get complicated. What do you think makes someone ready to choose love over fear? How do we know when we're brave enough to build something together instead of protecting ourselves alone?" "Okay," Amara said, and the simple word carried the weight of forgiveness and possibility and new beginnings. Okay, okay, let's figure out how to be a family. A real family, with all the beautiful mess that comes with it. Michael leaned forward and kissed her, soft and careful and full of 3 years of missing her. And Amara kissed him back with the warmth of someone who'd never really given up hope. They were interrupted by the soft pad of bare feet on hardwood, and they separated to find Zoe standing in the hallway, rubbing her eyes and looking at them with the satisfied expression of a child whose world had just rearranged itself in exactly the right way. "Are you staying for breakfast, Daddy?" she asked, as if this was the most natural question in the world. Michael looked at Amara, who nodded with a smile that promised everything he'd ever wanted. "Yes," he said to Zoe, to Amara, to the life he was finally brave enough to claim. "I'm staying for breakfast. And lunch. And dinner. And all the breakfasts after that." "Good," Zoe said seriously. "Because Mama makes really good pancakes, and you should probably learn how to make them too." 3 months later, Michael's penthouse sat empty while he lived in the controlled chaos of a 4-bedroom house in East Atlanta with a backyard big enough for a swing set and a garden where Liam could look for bugs and Maya could practice cartwheels and Zoe could have a puppy named Mozart who had no musical ability whatsoever, but unlimited enthusiasm for chasing tennis balls. The Henderson Industries crisis had cost his company $12 million and resulted in a management restructuring that had actually made Harrison Pharmaceuticals stronger and more efficient. Michael had learned to delegate more effectively, to trust his team to handle emergencies while he attended school events and family dinners, to measure success in terms of bedtime stories read and soccer games attended rather than just quarterly profits. The children had adapted to their new reality with the resilience that seemed to be their birthright. Maya's cast had come off 6 weeks exactly, and she'd celebrated by doing 17 consecutive cartwheels in the backyard while Liam provided commentary and Zoe accompanied her on piano. They called Michael Daddy without hesitation now, introduced him to their friends as their father, and had stopped asking if he was the staying kind because he'd proven it in 100 small ways every day. Amara wore an engagement ring, a simple solitaire that she'd chosen herself because Michael had learned that the most important decisions were the ones they made together. They were planning a small wedding for the following spring, when Maya's gymnastics season ended and Liam finished his dinosaur project for school. And Zoe could perform at the ceremony because she'd learned to play canon in D, and was convinced it was the most beautiful wedding song ever written. On a Saturday morning in late autumn, as Michael stood in the kitchen teaching Maya how to flip pancakes while Liam read dinosaur facts aloud, and Zoe provided musical accompaniment and Amara graded papers at the kitchen table, his phone rang with a call from his assistant about a potential merger opportunity. "Can it wait until Monday?" he asked, not taking his eyes off Maya's careful pancake flipping technique. "It's a pretty significant opportunity, Mr. Harrison." Michael looked around the kitchen, at children who trusted him completely, at a woman who'd given him a second chance at the most important thing he'd ever lost, at a life built on love rather than fear. "Everything significant can wait until Monday," he said. "Today is for pancakes." He hung up and turned his attention back to Maya, who had successfully flipped her pancake and was beaming with pride. "Perfect technique," he told her, and she smiled the kind of smile that reminded him exactly why he'd finally learned to stay. Later that evening, after the children were asleep and he and Amara were cleaning up the remnants of a day spent in the backyard, raking leaves that the children had immediately jumped in, picking the last tomatoes from Liam's carefully tended garden, teaching Zoe to throw a football with her non-dominant hand, Michael found himself thinking about the man he'd been 3 years ago. That man had believed that love was something that happened to you, something you either controlled or were controlled by. He'd thought that family was a complication, that commitment was a limitation, that the measure of a life well lived was how much you could accumulate and how little you could need from other people. But watching Zoe fall asleep with her head on his shoulder during their nightly story time, seeing Liam's face light up when Michael remembered details from his dinosaur lectures, feeling Maya's small hand slip into his whenever they walked anywhere together, he understood now that love wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you built, day by day, choice by choice, moment by moment. And the best part wasn't the grand gestures or the dramatic revelations. The best part was the ordinary magic of Saturday morning pancakes, of goodnight kisses that smelled like children's shampoo, of a woman who loved him enough to trust him with the most precious things in her world. "What are you thinking about?" Amara asked, settling beside him on the porch steps as they watched the fireflies begin their evening dance in the backyard. "Just all of it," Michael said, taking her hand. 3 years ago, I thought I was protecting myself by walking away from this. Now I can't imagine what I thought I was protecting myself for. You weren't ready then, Amara said simply. Some people need to learn how to be loved. Some people need to learn that staying is stronger than leaving. And some people need 3 amazing children to teach them what really matters. That too. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of their neighborhood settling into evening, children being called in for baths, the distant sound of a lawn mower, a dog barking at something only it could see. Normal sounds. Family sounds. The soundtrack of a life built on the radical act of choosing each other, every day, over and over again. Michael, Amara said as they prepared to go inside. Yes. I'm glad you came back. I'm glad you let me. As they turned off the porch light and locked the door behind them, Michael caught a glimpse of their reflection in the glass, a man and woman who'd found their way back to each other, heading upstairs to check on children who would wake up tomorrow secure in the knowledge that both their parents would be there for whatever the day might bring. It wasn't the life Michael had planned, but it was the life he'd never known he wanted. And tomorrow, when Zoe played Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star for the 100th time and Liam explained why triceratops were actually herbivores and Maya demanded to know if she could learn to do a back handspring, he would be there to listen, to learn, to love them through all the ordinary, extraordinary moments that make a family. He'd finally learned the most important lesson of all. Some things are worth staying for. And some people are worth becoming better for. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get a second chance to choose love over fear, family over solitude, and staying over leaving. Michael Harrison had taken that second chance with both hands and built something beautiful from it. Something that would last.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazy and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.